There we go. Okay, so in defense of magical thinking, epistemologies of the possible. If I have learned anything in the past several years of teaching anxious, forlorn, desperate students, barely into their second decade and already fatalists or nihilists, it is that we desperately need magical thinking as a praxis, a pedagogy, as the building blocks for a socially just world that has hitherto seemed improbable, if not impossible. In this paper, I will make the case for magic and magical thinking as a crucial hermeneutics in epistemologies of the possible. This paper is my attempt to articulate the framework of such a praxis and the urgency with which this paradigm shift is needed within the academy. To that end, my audience today and in this paper is academicians and those tasked with mentoring future anthropologists and any other social scientists, frankly, but whose training very much implicates them in the dogmatism of Western, that is, settler colonial, epistemological theorizing. As I will show, many working within resistant knowledge frameworks and outside of academia are already or have long since been savvy to the legitimacy and importance of magical thinking, much like the water diviners we were just listening about which we were just listening, right? In COVID-19 and the Turn to Magical Thinking, an article published in Sapiens in 2020, Gusterson argued that the world had turned to, quote, all manner of magical thinking, end quote, in its desperation amidst the ongoing pandemic. Within this casual taxonomy, Gusterson included such tools as, quote, miracle cures, end quote, and conspiracy theories. While deception and misinformation certainly proliferated during the pandemic, Gusterson was mistaken to equate these to magical thinking. More problematic still in this article was Gusterson's misreading of Amilcar Cabral's reference to the talismans that soldiers in the fight for an independent Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde wore for protection during armed battles. I will address that example in more detail shortly, but first, we must understand that this type of misreading stems from the epistemic violence inherent in hegemonic or mainstream notions of the scientific. What Gusterson might better have cautioned against was wishful thinking. But this linguistic choice suggests that the colonial epistemologies that built early anthropological thinking continue to pervade it and must actively be resisted and undone. Shifting our language away from, quote, magical thinking to wishful thinking is a simple first step, and we should all adjust our language and discourses accordingly. Beyond that, we must, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o suggested, decolonize our minds as well. Reconnecting with magic. Within anthropological literature, it is commonly held that magic is a, quote, set of activities and technologies intended to manipulate invisible or immaterial agencies and energies to an advantageous end, end quote. There are a few others, but this encapsulates the mainstream of thinking within the anthropology of magic. This definition, and most others in circulation, are largely the result of the role that anthropologists have had in establishing the discursive limits and readings of magic. That is, these definitions of magic are eidic, they are not emic definitions. The term magic that encompasses what we know and recognize as magic today and what falls into the taxonomy of magical is largely the product of colonialist anthropologies that, following Enlightenment epistemology and the Euro-American settler colonial impulses to supremacy, establish hierarchical distinctions among science, religion, and magic. In an effort to monopolize and standardize knowledge by way of delegitimating or discrediting different knowledge ways, colonizers, anthropologists among them, erected discrete separations between these methods of experiencing, making sense of, and surviving in the world. I note this because when left unquestioned, the discursive assumptions lend themselves to misreading ancestral, miscategorized, or everyday magics, in the same way that Gusterson did in his misplaced ridicule of magical thinking. And I should say that's everyday quote magics, because as I just explained, we created that word, and it's not necessarily how everyone else reads it. Indeed, many examples of what early anthropologists like Evans Pritchard or Tyler referred to as magic have different identifiers among those whose knowledges they sought to exploit. The contemporary notion of magic is therefore a socio-political construction made up by those who used various discursive means to establish primarily white, male, Euro-American supremacy and marginalize all others. Let us not forget that the majority of magic and magical thinking is often discredited among numerous minority populations, women, queer folk, and any others that have been colonized or decimated by the ravages of colonialism over time. More recent literature in the anthropology of magic has begun to move away from these outdated understandings and assumptions about it. And those delimiting categories, once taken for granted as discrete and necessary, have begun to dissolve. Study of magic and magical thinking is moving away from negative connotations and ways to explain negative events and towards pro-social generative analyses. But we need more than just a consumptive analysis of magic and magical thinking, and in order to sufficiently correct for centuries of epistemic violence, begin to incorporate epistemological pluralism in our pedagogies. Fortunately, resistant knowledges found within Afrofuturism, indigenous cosmovisions, magical realism, among others, have long since been authors and engaged with epistemologies of the possible. As Avi Brooks reminds us in his discussion of foresight, Afrofuturism grew out of the need of oppressed Black peoples to envision a future in which they not only survived, but thrived. So let's talk about magical thinking and epistemologies of the possible. Magical thinking, then, has always been part of epistemologies of hope. When Cabral shared the story of his comrades going into battle with their talismans, he did so not to insult or discredit them, or to diminish the significance of these artifacts as essential armor among them. He did not disparage them as parochial or superstitious, or anything otherwise derogatory as implied by Gusterson's, or a great many other white readers' interpretation. Instead, we should read them as evidence of hope in the face of the improbable. The talismans were physical symbols of protection, if not of their immediate corporeal bodies, then of their anticipated liberation, a future wherein they could thrive in the absence of exploitative, violent settler colonialism. Seeing and imagining the improbable, if not the impossible. So-called rational thinking and epistemologies rooted in settler colonialism have led us to the majority of the current urgent issues we find ourselves in as a planet. And these are the issues that we teach about in our classrooms, that we teach our students to address. And in my experience, over the past 10 years of teaching, it has become increasingly difficult for students to see the way out of the problems, right? And we're not just talking about sticky problems. These are the problems that especially younger generations feel hopeless about. And partially that's because the classrooms of institutions within empires largely responsible, right? That's because so-called rational thinking and epistemologies rooted in settler colonialism have dominated the classrooms of institutions within empires, largely responsible for the discrediting of magic and resistant knowledge ways in pursuit of power and capitalist accumulation, right? So it's no wonder then that my students over the years have increasingly struggled to tap into their creative imaginaries, to tap into magical thinking as a way to imagine solutions to problems that, quote, rational thinking has created and intellectualized as necessary to the civilizing of the rest of the world. So to rebuild this capacity, we must shift our pedagogies away from hegemonic epistemological canons sprinkled with token voices from the peripheries, to epistemological pluralisms toward a transformative social theory. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there. I would love to talk about this more in Q&A, but I want to give our last speaker enough time to speak. Thank you for listening.